Over the summer, I attended EAS online and I gave a talk in the DEI section about being a first generation graduate student. And later on in the panel, we were asked a question that was like, what's the most stressful thing about being an early career researcher? And the guy that answered before me, he had a great answer. He gave a great talk. He talked about this pressure to publish because when you're a postdoc, you're on a 3 year contract, which means you're moving probably across the world to a new lab. You're going to be working with new data, new methods, and a new group. You have to learn all of this and then somehow do really great research, write high impact, highly cited papers in about 18 months. Because 2 years into your 3 year postdoc, you're going to be spending all your time applying for positions again to start the cycle all over. And I agree that this is really stressful. It's a high pressure situation. But while he was answering, I couldn't help but think, like, what a luxury to worry about publishing. Because, well, here's my answer.
The big thing that's been stressing me out lately has been kind of the general acceptance of just serial sexual harassment and assault in astronomy. I guess as a woman, it's really hard to just like research and then also deal with that with like 50% of my brain for like the last 5 months. And it's hard for me to like see a future in astronomy when like half the community is like, oh, we're fine with not really treating women as people. It's hard for me to like recruit women into the field. And it's been really stressful to like deal with job stuff. And then also just that in general.
What I was thinking the whole time is about how I am constantly thinking about serial sexual harassment and assault in astronomy and how the community doesn't really respond. And I think about it a lot because it happens so often. Like, I just wake up, it's 8 a.m., I've got my coffee, I'm scrolling through the archive, and it's like, oh, here's 26 people who decided it was fine to author a paper with this serial sexual harasser. And it kind of like, it just ruins my whole day. I spend a lot of my research time being like, do I even belong here? How can I feel respected in a field where women aren't valued? How can I see a future in a field where people are just fine working with sexual harassers? They don't care about the women, the victims. They just care about how this person can help their career. And it makes it hard to envision a future. And it makes it hard to focus on research. But I don't want to stop researching astrophysics. So I thought this is the plan. If I said what I needed to say on this topic, just got it out of my brain and onto a video, in the future, when this happens, every 3 weeks, I could just retweet this video. It would be out there and it wouldn't have to be in my brain and I could focus on research. I think a video is a good format for this just because this is a hot take, but Twitter is bad, actually. When you tweet responding to sexual harassment, like, you're rewarded for being like really quick with your response, which I think removes this time where you would think about something and like develop a well thought out opinion and then post it. And then you're also rewarded for being super mean, which I'm not into. I don't think this discourse and the nuance it requires can be accomplished on Twitter, but seemingly that's where it's happening, and I don't think that's for the best. So I wrote everything I want to say down. It's really long, and I'm going to get it out there and then never talk about it again, and it's going to be great. But before we get started, I want to talk about the scope of this problem. So this is a well-known study of undergraduate physics and astronomy majors, and they find that 75% self-report that they've been sexually harassed or assaulted, like in the context of their major, so like at school or at an event related to physics or astronomy. And if you made a pie chart of professional physics and astronomy, like 20% of these people are women, right? Like all the way up from undergrads, which I think is like 30% for astronomy, and then like 13% for professors. So 15% of this pie chart, 15% of astronomers have been sexually assaulted or harassed at work. And this is a huge percentage, which is why I have such a problem with it. Like, it shouldn't be an acceptable number. But one thing I want to say is I don't think you can map this 15% that's been sexually assaulted and harassed to an equal percentage of men who are doing this harassing. This is a study done for college campuses, because I don't think this is done for our field specifically, but they found that 46% of assaults on college campuses are done by men who have assaulted 10 or more women. So rather than one man assaulting one woman, you have these prolific sexual harassers and assaulters who are just harassing as many women as they can get their hands on. And just anecdotally, this was the case in my grad program. There were 2 guys who were just always sexually harassing women, and I think if you just grabbed a graduate cohort with 40 people, so like 9 women, and you said, have you ever been sexually harassed or assaulted on campus? And you asked who it was, they would all point to the same 1 or 2 guys. So if we look at our pie chart again, I don't think 15% of men are assaulting 15% of women. It's more like 1 or 2%. Like this tiny slice of terrible people that are ruining it for everyone. So without irony, hashtag not all men. Because I work with a lot of men, and if you're watching this because you know me in real life and you're thinking I'm going to spill some tea on someone high up in the field that I've worked with who has done this, I am happy to report that while I've been sexually harassed at work, it was always by like a graduate student when I was a graduate student, or most of the time undergrads. And I think this is the case for everyone. There are these prolific serial abusers, and they're just responsible for a lot of harassment in the field. So again, looking at this pie chart, it also makes the fact that this is still a problem so infuriating. Because if it's such a small percentage of men, wouldn't it be easier just to kick those guys out and then shrink this chart of women who are sexually assaulted and harassed at work? Like, wouldn't that be easy? So this is really long, and it's a lot. And I wanted to say not all men up top, because not only do I believe that this is the case, like there's this tiny fraction of men who are doing this, but also I think because men are not experiencing the sexual harassment, or at least not nearly on the scale that women are, it might be easy for them to ignore that it's happening. Because they're not harassing and assaulting women, none of their colleagues are, and maybe they don't work with that many women because there aren't that many women in the fields. They might not think this is a problem. And so I wanted to draw your attention to this detail before we get going. And I also want to do a content warning, because when this conversation is had, oftentimes the response is like, well, why are we supposed to believe this story? Maybe it was a mistake that happened. So because of that, I think it's necessary to go through some detailed cases where I outline exactly what the harassment was and the number of victims over the number of years. And I will give you a timestamp warning. Oh, I'll learn how to do videos. A timestamp warning for the section you should skip if you're a victim of sexual harassment and assault, because I don't think you need to watch that. You know what happens. But if you don't know what happens, I think it's really important for you to watch the gory details. So, let's do it. So before I go into detailed stories, I want to describe the power structure of academia. So if you imagine academia as a pyramid, the bottom layer is going to be made up of undergraduate students. And for a lot of undergrads, the goal is to become a professor of their field. But at every level, when you move up, there are just less spots than before. So there are more undergrads that want to go to grad school for physics and astronomy than there are spots in graduate school for physics and astronomy. And a PhD doesn't guarantee you a spot at the postdoc level because there are more PhDs in physics and astronomy than there are postdocs positions in physics and astronomy. And the same goes for faculty positions. So at every level, you have people that want to move forward, leaving the field just because there aren't enough spots. So how do we choose who gets to move up? And the answer is recommendation letters, right? Like when an undergraduate student applies to graduate school, they write a CV, they tailor their application package for the school, but most importantly, they have good recommendation letters from faculty who can like vouch for the student. They can say, this person worked in my lab for a summer, they were a great researcher, they have potential, please invite them into your graduate school. And the letters really make or break who gets in. If you don't have people vouching for you and saying that you'll become a good researcher, it's just much less likely that you'll get into graduate school. And that's the same thing when you're applying for a postdoc. Your PI who worked with you in graduate school for like 5 years is going to write you a letter. And that letter better say you're his best student that he's ever had so that you can get a postdoc and move forward. So you can see how important these recommendation letters are. The faculty are quite literally choosing who they think is the best, who has the best potential, who will make the best future researcher, and like plucking them up and pulling them up a level. And when people talk about this, they also mention something that's called the leaky pipeline. So if 33% of undergrads in physics and astronomy are women, you would expect that at the faculty level, 33% are women. Like the overall number is going to get smaller just because there's less faculty positions, but the fraction should stay the same. But that's not the case. At every move, more and more women are leaving the field when compared to men by percentage. So this is called the leaky pipeline. That's weird. I'm just checking my notes. I don't remember why I wanted to bring up the leaky pipeline. Let's move on. But what I want to say is because at the top there are way more men than women. Men are quite literally the gatekeepers of science. And I don't mean this in like a negative mansplaining way, but it's like if you are an undergraduate woman and you want to get into biology research, you will go meet a professor who's most probably a man. He will introduce you to his postdoc, who's also most probably a man, just by the numbers. And you will have to meet this postdoc at like Thursday night in some random building on campus in the basement to like learn research techniques. And that's just how it is. But you can see how men who are creepy and gross could take advantage of this situation. If you think it's fine to sexually harass your undergrads, you have access to a lot of undergrads. And if those undergrads want to move forward and go to graduate school, when they're sexually harassed, they are presented with, should I report him and lose my letter of recommendation? Like, I'm a junior, I don't have time to get more research before applications are due, so I won't have a letter from a research advisor. Or should I just deal with this and get my letter of recommendation? And because of this power structure, it's much, much more damaging for someone in a position of power, like someone in a faculty position, to harass and assault these undergrads because there's no recourse for them. Like, choosing to report is literally career ending, like before they've even started their careers. And that power structure is what allows them to be so successful at sexually harassing and assaulting women, because they know that they don't need these undergrads. There are hundreds of undergrads who want research experience, but these undergrads need them. They need that letter of recommendation if they want to move forward. That's what makes this topic and this discussion so heinous to me. They know exactly how much power they have over these undergrads. They know why there's very little consequence. And they're just emboldened to continue harassing and assaulting young women. I don't like it. you understand why it's such a problem for a person in a position of power in academia to harass and assault these younger people in the field. But again, as I mentioned earlier, people who hear this, they don't necessarily hear exactly what the sexual harassment and assault entailed. And people, I think, are just willing to give them the benefit of the doubt and kind of minimize the experiences of these women. So I do think it's really important to go into detail on these cases. I have 3 examples, but there are so many. It was like hard to pick which examples I was going to talk about. And I'm only talking about cases that have been like exposed and talked about on the news, and there have been many interviews, and like the details of the Title IX complaints were made public. So again, I'm not outing anyone. But like I said, if you are a victim, you don't need to hear this and skip to this time step. So the first person is Christian Ott. Oh, I'm going to say their names, but none of the names of the victims, just because I don't think that their lives should be associated with the terrible things that people did to them. But Christian Ott is at Caltech. Oh, and I've printed it out. I'm just going to read it without comment, hopefully, on what was done. So it's 2013. Ott fires a first-year graduate student he had been working with because he couldn't emotionally deal with her anymore. His group was talking a lot on Skype and I presume Slack and emails, and so all of like the transcripts of these documents were given to the Title IX office and then published in the Title IX report. So here's a quote. Ott messaged her 5 days after firing her. Of all my students, I cared most about you, and I failed in the worst way. My problem is that I don't want to be in a power position, but I factually am. So later, he's having a conversation with another one of his graduate students, also a female. I'm going to call her student B. And he's talking about student A. And he said he fired student A because she was using her sexual influence over him to not do work. And Ott tells student B that he fired her because he was in love with her. It's 2014. Ott attained early tenure after only 5 years of employment. 2014. It's reported that Ott is continually getting drunk and messaging his students at very late into the night and saying inappropriate things. He keeps messaging student B and discussing how he's still in love with student A. He also details a previous relationship that he's had with the student. And he says, I'm just so happy that I have a female grad student who is actually sane and I can talk to. And another one, do you think I'm a shady person because I let myself be emotionally involved with my student? I think I may actually be prone to this sort of thing. 2015, student B quits. She just thinks she's like emotionally responsible for this man, and he's sending her deeper and deeper messages at all hours of the day, and she's not into it. So she files a Title IX complaint. The Title IX office then brings student A in and hands her a stack of 86 love poems that Ott had written about her on his Tumblr page. So imagine you're student A. You get into your dream school, because like Caltech's a really good school. You work with this like hotshot new physicist who gets tenure after only 5 years. Amazing. Weird. But you're student A. You're working with this guy for a year, and then he fires you. He says you're not a good student, you're not progressing, you're fired. And so she starts a new lab, she starts a new project. I'm sure she's dealing with like massive imposter syndrome now, because it's like, oh, I was fired because I was bad, like is my research good now? And then she finds out a year later that not only was she fired because her advisor had fallen in love with her, she was the topic of conversation in their group and in the department for a full year. He was talking about how he was in love with her. And he wrote her 86 poems. Like, that's absolutely terrifying that could happen to her without her even knowing. And so student A and student B kind of team up, and they work on this Title IX complaint together. What you'll notice later is that sometimes when a student makes a Title IX complaint, whoever is working in the office will be like, well, let's not take this too seriously. I'll talk to him about it. And then like nothing ever happens. So anytime anything does happen, it's because these brave women, like these two, kept going to the office, kept saying, this is not an agreeable solution, like something needs to be done, he needs to be disciplined. So, Ott's suspended for 9 months with pay. But then it's extended to a year because he contacts one of the students during his suspension when he wasn't supposed to. Once his suspension is up, he's making plans to come back to campus, and there's just kind of mass outrage. And a committee is meeting with him, and he resigns. Presumably, that's what they requested. So he wasn't fired, he resigned. And the very next semester, it's announced that he was hired for a 2-year position at a university in Finland in January. So, like, he resigns in a fall semester. He's got a new position starting the next semester. And of course, again, there's outrage. People are upset about this. Finnish astronomers pen an open letter. So I can read a quote from it. Harassment is a serious offense that too often goes unreported and unchallenged. When victims come forward, they must be able to rely on our support. We must address the issues head on. Otherwise, we not only enable harassers, but we also send a devastating message to the individuals who have been harassed and whose careers are often destroyed or seriously disrupted, as well as to the whole community. So this is signed by a bunch of Finnish astronomers. In February, they cancel his employment, and the reason they gave in, like, the press release is, like, we should have checked in with the community. And it's so frustrating that that's the answer. But I have to wonder, like, what was in his job application? Because as someone who's failed to get a couple tenure track positions, I know that when you're making this application, like, you need to write a research statement, a mentoring statement, a teaching statement. You need, most importantly, those 3 letters of recommendation. 3 to 5 for a faculty position. And I presume someone with tenure at Caltech wasn't getting a postdoc. They were getting a faculty position. And faculty positions get hundreds of applications. So, was his application literally the best one? Did he mention that he can't mentor graduate students without firing them because he fell in love with them? Did his letters of recommendation mention this? Like, who wrote the letters and what did they say? Did they mention that he was suspended for a full year because he sexually harassed multiple graduate students? And did the committee read those and think it was fine? Like, this was very public. It was on the news. Like, if they had Googled his name, it would have come up, so they knew about it. And it just, did this university, whoever was on the hiring committee, think that whatever research he would have done in 2 years is more important than the fact that you would alienate every single woman that's in your faculty, every single female grad student, that female grad students would think they were going to apply to that school and then be like, oh, I can't work with that guy, and they would apply somewhere else. Like, what would he have done? Would it have been worth it? Yeah. And also, there was more into this story. It wasn't just sexual harassment, but because that's what I'm focusing on in this video, that's mostly what I talked about. He was also just one of those bully advisors. A student talked about how he was threatened to be thrown off a balcony. Another student got fired in such a time that he was threatened with deportation. And he wrote this up online, and in his write-up, he was like, I was $5 away from being deported, and, like, someone had to give him $5 so he could pay for, like, this paperwork. And it's just, like, really cruel and terrible. He also made up a fake female postdoc called Ursula Gamma that he would put on papers, I guess, to make it seem like he could hire women without sexually harassing them until he fired them. So I wonder how much of his resignation came from those things rather than the sexual harassment. So what's he up to now? This is what his Twitter says. You know, canceled. I'm going to talk about that later. But when comparing Ott to the others I'm about to talk about, to me, from what I could see publicly online, it seemed that he took responsibility for his actions in such a way that he left the field. Like, I think he works as a data scientist now. He's not rolling up to meetings uninvited and just, like, making his presence known. Like, he seems to have left astronomy. And I was gonna say that that's great. Like, you did a bad thing and you left, but, like, that shouldn't damage your whole life. You can just go somewhere else and find a new life in whatever field that is. But there's some mentions on Twitter, like, apparently he's very litigious and he's suing the two women, or he tried to sue the two women who penned that open letter that got his employment canceled at the Finnish University. And allegedly, he's still emailing the heads of their departments to say, like, these people are bad, see what they're doing to me. So I'm going to say that's not a great look. Next. The next one is Lawrence Krauss at Case Western, and then he moved to ASU. It's kind of a theme that they change universities, by the way. So Lawrence Krauss, he's a physicist. I think he's more famous, though, for being, like, baby's first atheist. Like, he's, like, really active, or he was, in the skeptics community. So the timeline. 2006, he was associated with CFI, which is a skeptic institute, and there was a woman there working part-time who hoped to get a full-time position. And when she met Krauss, she told him this, and he invited her to dinner. First, he asked to meet her at the hotel room where he's staying. So she goes up, assuming they'll go down to have dinner at the hotel. Here's the quote. She said Krauss made a comment about her eye makeup, got very close to her face. Suddenly, he lifted her by the arms and pushed her onto the bed beneath him, forcibly kissing her and trying to pull down the crotch of her tights. She said she struggled to push him off. When he pulled out a condom, she got out from under him, said, "I have to go," and rushed out of the room. Krauss denies that this was not consensual. 2007, so he's working at Case Western. A physics undergrad comes to his office to interview him for the school paper. He closed the door, made inappropriate jokes, and invited her to dinner. And she wrote in the paper, "There was even one particular creep of a professor who once told me he thought differently of me compared to the other students and asked me to dinner, a situation so disturbing that it left me upset for weeks afterward." So that's the same thing Ott said, right? Like, you're different from other girls. So gross. So the physics department read this in the paper, and they were like, "This is unacceptable. You shouldn't be treated this way. Here's the way that you should make an official complaint and name this person," which, like, A+ physics department at Case Western. So she does so. As a result, Krauss was not allowed near the student and had to warn the department before he could come to campus. But by this time, like, they investigated, this was the result. But by the time they had the results, he was already a professor at Arizona. And he was allowed to attend a colloquium at Case Western in 2009, and he also says he was never banned from campus. 2009, Krauss attends an event at the Perimeter Institute in Waterloo. An anonymous sexual complaint was made. There's no more information about this, but Waterloo banned him from campus by 2012, though Krauss maintains that he is not banned from that campus. Here's a picture of him with Jeffrey Epstein, and he defends Jeffrey Epstein's actions, saying, "I remain skeptical, and I support a man whose character I believe I know. If you want to condemn me for that, so be it." 2011, a woman who first met Krauss as an undergrad ran into him at a bar during a convention. He gave her a seat and then ran his hand up and down her leg under the table. Here's the quote. "I kind of shifted away. He put his hand on again, I crossed my legs. He put his hand on again, and eventually I had to, like, physically turn my entire body." Krauss denies that this happened. People who worked with Krauss at CFI were kind of distancing themselves from him because of his behavior. Here's an email exchange about a private trip they were going to take with the CFI Institute and, like, donors and members. "I really don't want Krauss on this trip. His behavior on past trips has been offensive to many, and this is a very expensive and small vessel." 2015, at a dinner event at a school's university club, a 19-year-old undergraduate said she was left feeling acutely uncomfortable when he looked at her from head to toe, smirked, and told her he liked her short jumper. 2015, by this point, websites had started compiling all this information, and people, it was kind of an open secret. People were like, we're not going to invite Krauss to events, we don't want him to harass our undergrads. And he would threaten to sue these people, and they would take the documents down. And he's also very litigious, which is why I'm telling you that he denies all of these actions, and it's alleged. So BuzzFeed went back. They found all this info, and also surprisingly, BuzzFeed is the best reporting on sexual harassment and assault in academia. They did a bunch of interviews with people and got character statements. 2016, Krauss was a guest speaker at a convention in Australia. Another invited speaker was warned by so many people about his behavior that she acted like a watchdog. The speaker said, so I was like a watchdog, making sure that nothing untoward happened. When the conference delegates were chatting over drinks, one of the watchdog's friends asked for a picture with Krauss. As the woman held out her phone to take the picture, the watchdog saw Krauss reach over her friend's shoulder and grab her right. So this woman files a formal complaint at Arizona and also at the Australian school where the convention was being held. And neither school found sufficient evidence to substantiate allegations. However, Krauss resigns from ASU for personal reasons. 2018, he shows up at a conference like nothing happened, and outrage on Twitter, and then BuzzFeed reports on this. BuzzFeed also, as a result, posted interviews where they said they had discussed this with over 50 people who shared similar stories of misogyny and sexual harassment, often toward undergrads. And then in 2020, the first summer of COVID, I attended an online colloquium, and Lawrence Krauss was there, because I saw his name on the little guest list, and I was like, well, that's weird. And I kind of thought, maybe the host will boot him. So I would, periodically check, and they didn't. And I was like, well, is it my responsibility to, send a message to the host and be like, this is unacceptable, right? And the speaker, who was great, she's a very famous cosmologist. She was giving a talk, and it was a great talk. And at the end, he asked a question. I don't remember if he typed his question and the host read it, or if he mic'd himself and asked the question. But as soon as she heard his name, the speaker, I don't want to put words in her mouth, but her facial expression matched mine, where I was like, the audacity of this man. And I don't think it was her responsibility as the invited guest to mention anything about this, and I don't think she did either, because she tersely answered his very open-ended and annoying question, one of those questions, and then was just next, and didn't give him the opportunity to ask anything again. So she handled it great. But why would we let him come, guys? Shouldn't host institutions control their guest lists? Do we want serial sexual harassers to ask women questions at colloquia? I don't like this either. But yeah, that's where he's at today. He's retired from ASU. He's writing lots of books. I read some of his books in the past and I liked them, but I don't think I'm going to read any more from him. And then he tweets this. Defamation is a crime. False allegations against me were subsequently discredited. I retired from my university with full retirement benefits 2 years ago, and no student, postdoc, or collaborator of mine has ever lodged a complaint against me. Follow me on Twitter for more hot takes oof. But if you have to list all the people you didn't sexually harass when you're defending yourself against sexual harassment, and this again speaks to his litigiousness, this is a very lawyer-crafted, friendly statement. Yeah, so he's fine. He's still doing it. His book on climate change is going to come out soon. It's going to be a bestseller. Yeah, that's it. That's it with him. So the rule of threes, I'm going to talk about one more serial academic sexual harasser. And if you are an astronomer, you know who I'm going to talk about. I think this stack of paper is much bigger for this one. And this guy is kind of the inspiration for this video, because he just keeps posting papers, and people just keep working with him. And I'm not convinced they don't know the scope of his behavior, but they've either forgiven him or they think his science output is more important than his victims. But I'm gonna try to go through it. It's really upsetting to listen to. Geoff Marcy. So Geoff Marcy worked at San Francisco State, 1995. Graduate students stated that Geoff Marcy would rub her shoulders and one day grab when they were in a meeting together. Here's a quote from her. I had just gotten married and he would ask me, when are you getting a divorce? I just basically wanted to get my master's and leave. The same year, a different graduate student stated that Marcy would touch her hair and brush up to her with his legs, which would cause his to touch her. She told him more than a few times that this behavior made her uncomfortable, but he did not stop. Here's what she says. Because he was a vocal supporter of women in science. You can't be a vocal supporter of women in science and also rub your on them. It was contradictory in my head that he would have bad intentions, but at the same time it just felt so uncomfortable that after a few times I had to tell him to stop. Another student, he made lewd comments to her. She saw how distraught the other students were and confronted Marcy. All three women attempted to make a Title IX complaint with San Francisco State. The officer met with Marcy and said, this will end your career, and then they discussed, we might take sanctions in the future if he does things like this again, and that was the end of it. So two of these women leave astronomy. One of the students continued to work with Marcy in an attempt to finish her thesis. She met with him only sparingly. Marcy invites her to a conference, and here's her quote. He said, there's a problem. The conference hotel is full. I have a room, but it only has one bed. He just kind of sat there and looked at me with a grin on his face. He never said sleep with me or anything like that. It was always in that nebulous gray zone. She insisted that he get her a separate hotel room, and he acquiesced. So that's 3 complaints with witnesses. They all try to make a Title IX complaint. Nothing is done. 2 of these women leave astronomy. 1 escapes by the skin of her teeth. And this is when he moves from San Francisco State to Berkeley. And again, I would very much like to know what was in his application. Because how can you write a mentoring statement when 66% of your students have left astronomy directly because of you? Who wrote letters and said, oh, he's such a great mentor, and didn't mention the Title IX complaints against him? Who wrote the letters? Do you feel guilty? Also, he was hired at Berkeley. So did Berkeley not care? Did they ask San Francisco State? Did they get in contact with the head of the department and say, oh, we've heard about his predilection for harassing his graduate students and assaulting them. What do you have to say about that? Or did they just not care? I didn't want to mention science, but 95 is the year the first exoplanet was discovered. Hey, I'm editing this. Sorry, it's so long. I'm just realizing that now. You just saw me stumble over my words where I said, oh, the first exoplanet was discovered in 1995. I know that's not true. Don't at me. It's just, I didn't want to talk about science, but now I feel like I have to. So the first exoplanet was not discovered in 1995. The first exoplanet around an M class, or a sun-like star, was discovered in 1995 by the Swiss team. The technique the Swiss used to detect this planet was pioneered by Geoff Marcy and his graduate student Paul Butler at San Francisco State, although I feel like they were working at Berkeley the whole time, but just associated with San Francisco State. It's the radial velocity technique, or it's kind of the Doppler shift technique. Essentially, if you have a massive planet like a Jupiter going around a sun like the star, it's so massive it's going to cause the star to wobble a little bit, and you can measure those teeny tiny changes in radial velocity and infer without directly imaging that there is an exoplanet of some mass around that star. So Marcy and Butler pioneered the technique. They saw the announcement of the Swiss being like, we've got it, first exoplanet around an M-class star. The next night, Marcy and Butler, they go to Keck Observatory, they make the exact same measurement, they confirm the result. And they even went back and looked at their old data, and they were like, oh, damn it, we had it, we just didn't see it, we didn't publish it, and that happens sometimes in science. Over the next 5 years, let me put a plot of exoplanet discoveries. Most of the discoveries at this time were using this radial velocity method, and 70% of those discoveries were made with Marcy and Butler's team. So now, people are like, this is really exciting. The field is exploding. Everyone wants to be an exoplanet scientist, and that's still the case today. And I'm not bitter at all about choosing dark matter. I'll get a job. It's fine. So that's what allows Marcy to move to Berkeley. That's what allows him to maintain a career with this open secret. They're like, wow, this guy is impressive. This guy is going to get the Nobel Prize. And in fact, the Nobel Prize Committee was like on the list of things they talked about every year. When will we give these exoplanet scientists a Nobel Prize for discovering an exoplanet around a sun-like star? Because presumably that's the first step to finding like a habitable planet or an alien world or something. The problem is that the Nobel Prize goes to 3 people. That's it. And you have 2 groups of 2. So you have to decide between like the Swiss, who did it first, but they were using this group's technique, and then this group found a bunch more planets. And they actually didn't award the Nobel Prize for exoplanets until 2019. And it makes me think of that movie, A Beautiful Mind, with Russell Crowe as John Nash. At the end, you have Russell Crowe in old man makeup as John Nash. And he's like teaching a class, and then a man comes up to him after, and he's like, hi, I'm from the Nobel Prize Committee. And then John Nash stops, and he's like, y'all came to see if I was crazy, huh? Because presumably the Nobel Prize Committee does not want to make a fool of themselves. They do not want to accidentally give an award to someone who is going to embarrass them later. So maybe something like having an open secret of serial sexual harassment over decades would make the Nobel Prize Committee pause and be like, should we do this? So the award wasn't given until 2019, and it was given to the Swiss team and also James Peebles for unrelated cosmology stuff. And there was some controversy when this came out, because some people were like, well, should we deny someone an award for their actions after the work that deserved the award? And also, when the Nobel Committee announces what they're giving prizes to, they do a big presentation about why it's so important. All the plots that they had showing exoplanet discoveries via the radial velocity method were from Marcy's group. They were not from the Swiss team. So the committee definitely knew that there was another contender for this prize. But I went to the Swiss team. Okay, that's it for this edit. 95 is the year the first exoplanet was discovered, and obviously Geoff Marcy is big in that field, so it would have been really exciting for Berkeley to get a big exoplanet guy when this field is like bursting, and it's a really exciting time for this field. But surely there were other exoplanet people. And I want to say, like, maybe you should have hired his grad student, the one he harassed, the one who escaped. I don't know. So he moves to Berkeley. You might think, like, he's going to be like, new year, new me. I'm not going to sexually harass anyone. I've got a clean slate now. But he doesn't. And the timeline also gets really wonky. The timeline between the year 2000 and the year 2013 gets really wonky because there are so many stories. And not only are there so many stories of sexual assault, like grabbing conferences and rubbing his dick on people and hugging women who don't want to be hugged, but like there's also stories of people who see this because like he's so brazen. He's so confident that he's not doing anything wrong and he won't get caught, that he's doing this publicly, like at conferences, at group meetings, and in his classroom. And so multiple people are seeing it from different angles. So when you're seeing 75 stories on the internet about sexual assault and harassment done by Geoff Marcy, you get the picture that some of these are the same story, but different observers. And there's too many. There's literally too many to go through a list and read out loud. So instead, I'll just say that complaints were made in 2004, 2005, 2006, and on and on. And this was discussed as an open secret. People would tell their graduate students, like, if you see Geoff Marcy at a conference, don't be alone with him. A guy from Harvard mentioned that postdocs would be hired to work at Berkeley, and they wouldn't take the position because they don't want to be associated with him. They don't want to put their students in that position. So the stories are so numerous that it would be too long to like literally just read them, and I don't know which are the same story, like I said. But he was so prolific in his sexual harassment that someone published anonymously before a AAS meeting a kind of playbook for how people who are late career researchers will sexually harass and assault early career researchers. And I think that speaks to how often this happened. It was about Geoff Marcy, but they published it anonymously and didn't mention him. But they had seen him do this so many times that they established a pattern. And I can link to it, but I want to discuss this in a different way so you can understand how pervasive this behavior is. So here's a plot. On the x-axis is the length of the interaction. On a y-axis is the creep factor. Because the longer you talk to someone, the more creepy you're allowed to be before, like, someone observing this will say that something creepy happened. So this might not sound like it makes a lot of sense, but I hope with an example it will make sense. So you have 3 zones. Let's imagine an interaction. Say you are standing on a street corner and a random man walks by you, grabs your breast, and keeps walking. This is going to be up here in a green zone. Green means go, right? So the title of the plot is, when are you allowed to scream? You're allowed to scream here. A stranger you've never met before has grabbed your breast. In general, people will respond like, oh my god, I'm so sorry that happened to you. Someone might chase him. Someone might call the police, you know? But now, let's say you go on a Tinder date with a stranger. You guys walk around the park for 30 minutes, you get an ice cream, you turn to look at the ducks, and he grabs your... This is gonna be in, like, this yellow zone. Like, yeah, that shouldn't have happened to you, but, like, maybe you shouldn't be on Tinder, because Tinder is a hookup app. Even though it's an identical situation, right? Random man grabs your without your permission. And then if you go further, like, say you've been dating a man for 6 months, he keeps grabbing your breasts in public, you tell him to stop, and you don't like it, and when you talk about this with your friends, they're like, but he's just attracted to you. It's good that he's attracted to you. And so in that case, you're not allowed to scream. It's almost like a non-action. Does this make sense? So I'm going to map his playbook onto this plot, and I hope we'll see something interesting. It's hard for me to tell if this is going to work or not. Okay, so number 1. Friendly greeting in the hallway, big smiles. Do I recognize you? I've seen you at a conference, haven't I? So he's starting the interaction. It's not creepy at all. But you can see he's kind of like ticking her ego. He's like, I appreciate you as a scientist, undergrad woman who I've never met. Not creepy at all. The next greeting involves a soft touch on the arm or back. So he's increased the length of the interaction. He's also increased the creepiness factor, right? It's creepy to touch a woman you don't know. Number 3, an expression of deep yet sudden interest in a young woman's career and an invitation to go out for coffee to discuss her aspiration and goals. So this isn't creepy on its own, and this is a thing that could happen. Like, a professor might say, well, let's go get a coffee and discuss this. But there is this trick where these men who are serially sexually harassing and assaulting women are also pretending to be women's advocates, so they have more access to women. But here on the plot, not creepy, increasing the length of the interaction. Number 4, steering the discussion towards sexual topics. So this is very creepy. You can see, like, he's not talking about having sex with her. He's just talking about sexual topics. So if at this moment she's like, oh, I'm uncomfortable, and she goes to tell someone, they're going to be like, wait, he just talked about sex? That's not that weird. Number 5, an offer to drive you home after a late night at the department. So this puts you in a risky situation, right? And I do think this one is kind of creepy. Like, if he doesn't know you very well, it's creepy for someone to offer to drive you home, especially presumably you got there somehow, you know how to get back. 6, making sexual jokes and innuendos. So now he's increasing the sexual talk. This time it's a joke. And again, if you scream, like you go tell someone, they're going to be like, but you were okay with him talking about sex before. That's just the kind of relationship you have, right? Like, he wasn't asking you to have sex. He was making a joke. 7, arm around the waist or back to guide the woman somewhere. This is inappropriate at all times. Like, you shouldn't be doing this. Women know how to walk. You can use your finger to point to a room. But you can see if when he first met you, he introduced himself with like a hug, he might think that it's okay to touch you. And again, if she reports this behavior, he's going to be like, but I hug her all the time. Like, why would she be suddenly upset about this? You can see he's constantly straddling this line of okay. So if at any point he's confronted, he can act confused. Like, I would never do anything untoward. I'm interested in her career. I was just guiding her to the seminar. She doesn't want to go to the seminar? My goodness. I shouldn't interact with this woman ever again. Oopsie doodles. Number 8, full frontal hug. 9, back or shoulder massage. 10, kiss, cheek, forehead, or mouth. So he's increasing the touching. He's increasing the length of the interaction. And again, it's just straddling this line. So at any point, she can be like, you kissed me on the forehead, I didn't like it. And it's like, well, yesterday I was rubbing your back and you were fine with it. So I don't understand the problem now. And all of this is inappropriate. All of this should not be done by people in positions of power over you. It should never be done to a woman who is not receptive to it. And it happens so often that someone wrote down the steps to what he does. And I think that graph is interesting because that's part of this defense. Like, he's such an active vocal supporter of women. So, like, he would never do anything bad. And then when a woman is like, but he did all these things, his response is just like, but I'm confused why you're suddenly upset that I massaged your shoulders. Because yesterday I guided you to the seminar by, like, holding your back. And, like, we hold hands all the time in my group. It's totally fine. So, what actually happened? Starting in 2013, there was like a 2-year investigation. In 2015, BuzzFeed got their hands on the Title IX report and just broke the story. I'm going to read from a Nature paper discussing the allegations because they had access to the Title IX complaint, which was a 120-page document. So some of the complaints that got through eventually were from women who, like, kept calling the office and being like, I want to make sure this complaint is being taken seriously. Anonymous people from other universities would call and be like, we are worried about this behavior, and it just kept escalating. So the eventual complaints that got listed were, or various allegations, I should say, unwanted physical touching to inappropriate discussions of sex. Marcy admitted to some incidents, such as kissing an undergraduate student on the forehead and later on the cheek. The notes say, these things all happened, have been discussed 1,000 times. He denied other allegations, calling a report that he slid his hand up a student's skirt absurd. There was one where his whole class saw him take a picture of a student sucking on a lollipop, and she was completely unaware of the situation. So the worst allegation, the most serious, is about an off-site party at a AAS meeting in 2010. So these things happen. Undergrads go to parties and get drunk because, like, hopefully they're above 21. And they just want to hang out with other people their age. I don't think professors should go to these parties. I don't think that's where you belong. It seems inappropriate to me. But in this case, Marcy rode in a cab with an undergraduate woman to this party. It's plausible that he put his hand on the student's thigh during the cab ride. A bunch of people saw him dancing suggestively with her and buying her multiple drinks. Marcy says he likely purchased 2 drinks. She was so inebriated that she couldn't make it home by herself, so people saw Marcy carry her out of the building. He says he plunked her down on the bed of her hotel room and left. Hopefully that's what happened. Hopefully she was 21 as well, because some undergrads are 18. So the final report says, at minimum, respondent exercised poor judgment by first buying the undergraduate student drinks and then, when she was too intoxicated to care for herself, physically handling her and taking her alone via taxi to her hotel room and ultimately sitting with her on her hotel room bed. So, something I think about when I'm reading this is that I was an undergrad in 2010. I was 20 years old. And presumably this woman was also 20 and 21 in 2010, which means in 1995, when Geoff Marcy was first accused of sexual assault and harassment, we were 5 years old. And the idea that a 5-year-old who's interested in astronomy, like, this is what she has to look forward to. So what happened? So the report was published. It was out. And they were deciding what to do. This broke on BuzzFeed, and the very next day, a professor emailed the entire department at Berkeley with the subject line, "A difficult day." And I'd like to read a quote from it. The quote, "Of course, this is hardest for Geoff in this moment. For those who are willing and able, he certainly can use any understanding or support they can offer. This wouldn't include endorsement of the mistakes he acknowledges in an open letter on his website. I ask that those who have room for it, now or later, hear him out and judge whether there is room for redemption in all that will transpire." So something that's bad about Twitter is that if I was on Twitter in 2015 and I read that quote, I would immediately fire off a hot take about how this is the worst thing I've ever read. In no way should the feelings of the serial sexual harasser ever be most important. It is certainly not hardest for him. I would say it might be hardest for the woman he drunkenly carried to a hotel room. Or maybe it's hardest for the 2 women who sacrificed their careers in 1995 to make a Title IX complaint, only to check the news 20 years later and see that he's still doing the exact same things. Like, that is who it's hardest for. I don't understand how you can immediately throw away the victims and just say, "Oh, he must be really sad. He might not get to work at Berkeley anymore." Disgusting. But Twitter's a hellscape, right? So instead, let's think, like, maybe this guy was a friend of Jeff's. Maybe this was, like, surprising news to him. And I could understand that if this all came up, your first instinct would be like, "Oh no, my friend is hurting right now." But then, if you check the frickin' Nature paper, this same person, who I'm not going to name because I'm going to assume he's changed his opinion and supports women now, was one of the people that met with Geoff Marcy like once a year to be like, "You got to stop doing this, you got to stop doing this." So the man who says it's hardest for Geoff at this moment has known about this sexual harassment and assault for over a decade. He has heard countless stories, and yet he still thinks that Geoff Marcy is the biggest victim of all. And that's gross. So that's how the department responded. How did the university respond? So After this Title IX complaint, Marcy met with the vice provost of Berkeley faculty to discuss an alternative to proceeding with formal disciplinary action. So presumably Berkeley has some sort of ethics statement that Marcy broke, and I'm sure there are consequences outlined in that document, but they've decided that they could find some sort of alternative punishment, including a list of behaviors he's not allowed to do, like he's not allowed to touch students other than shaking hands. He's not allowed to discuss sex with students or socialize with students outside of professional activities. Marcy's failure to meet these terms would result in automatic sanctions. And that was it. That was it. That was a 2-year investigation outlining 2 decades of sexual harassment and assault. Almost uncountable stories. The head of the department is like, this is hardest for Geoff, and the department and the university are like, maybe we could find like an alternate plan, because like he just made a couple of little oopsie doodles over 25 years to like 75 women. Some of the faculty and the majority of the graduate students, like, again, are outraged. Geoff Marcy resigns. But in reality, he retires as an emeritus professor. So, what now? So since 2016, he's published 71 papers with like a lot of people. He was expelled from the NAS for his behavior. That's it. It feels like a lot. I want to talk about justice now. Like, what happens when you get accused of serial academic sexual harassment over a couple years? And I've outlined 4 steps of supporting a serial academic sexual harasser. The first is like, I've already talked about. Someone will be like, are we willing to throw away someone's career over allegations? And because that's such a common response, like someone will read the title that's like, Professor fired over sexual harassment, and they don't read the article that's like, here's the 16 counts of sexual harassment where 14 women left the field and never returned. So that's why I outlined some cases. So if you right now have the opinion, are we willing to throw away someone's career over these allegations, like, go back 20 minutes and watch the video. The second step is in how the story is framed. And I think there's really a problematic approach that the media takes when they're discussing these men. In the past, like in the 80s, they would have been described as like, you're Indiana Jones, like you're Richard Feynman's, like these men are just so attractive and they're so smart and they're so good at their jobs that the undergrads and the graduate women, they can't help it. They're all over him. And I think in the 90s, people realized how problematic that was, and no one really describes these men like that anymore, because these men don't exist, right? If you're taking advantage of your graduate students, it's bad. It's sexual assault and harassment. Like, it's never an Indiana Jones situation. But now, I feel like it's turned towards something else, where the media is describing these men as, like, nerdy, sheltered, confused, like, they got bullied in high school and never had a girlfriend before, so how can you expect them to know how to behave around women? It's all a big mistake. And I also don't think this exists. Like, this really minimizes the actual events. I think this is really problematic because even if the article lists all the allegations of sexual assault, it's still downplaying the behavior as like an innocent mistake. But how can you get a PhD in physics and become a tenured professor and also be an idiot? Like, that doesn't make sense. That person doesn't exist. The idea that scientists are antisocial nerds is not real, and we know this because to get a tenure track job, you have to talk to people. You have to stand in front of a classroom and teach. Like, you're not an antisocial nerd. You're not an idiot. You understand that sexual harassment is bad. But the way these articles portray it is like, oopsie, there he goes raping again. He's so confused, but he's so good at science. And I also want to note that when these men are defending themselves, they often put themselves in the first category with Indiana Jones. Like, I'm just so smart. These women are just so attracted to me. And it's not a good look. It's not a defense. You can't take advantage of your undergraduate students and say that they wanted it. So I think instead we should put them in a third category, one that actually exists. They are not Indiana Jones, and Richard Feynman should belong in this third category as well. They are not nerdy guys who just got bullied and they don't understand women. No, they are in a category with your Harvey Weinsteins, your Donald Trumps, your Brett Kavanaughs, your Larry Nassars. Who else? There's such a big list. George Tyndall, Matt Lauer. Like, you're in the serial assaulter category. That's where you are. There's no defense. You knew it was bad. You kept doing it. So the third step, after we realize they don't have a defense, you don't innocently and accidentally harass 70 women over 20 years. The defense is kind of like, but he wasn't found guilty of anything. And I think this is because when you have tenure, it's not only hard for the university to fire you, but also the university doesn't want to fire you. Like, you saw when these women make Title IX complaints, the first instinct of that office is to minimize it and be like, well, I'll talk to him. We'll see what we can do about it. They don't want to do an investigation because it costs money, it makes the university look bad, and they might have to fire a very expensive person to fire. And so what you'll see in all of these is that these men resign. They did not get fired. They just resigned with full benefits after never being accused of assault by a student or a postdoc. I forgot his quote, but yeah, I'll put it up. Like, they weren't fired, so they're not guilty, is the opinion. And that's really frustrating because, like, you've seen all the stories, you've seen the outcome of the investigation, and because of the university's inaction, their complete unwillingness to take a step to do anything, it adds to their defense, and it prevents them from being kicked out of the field because people are like, well, he wasn't fired, he's an emeritus professor at Berkeley, it's fine. And the final one is usually that, like, but he's so smart, and he was so good at his job, and do we really want to fire someone who's so good and so worthy of this position after such a small mistake? And I would maintain that these men are not good at their jobs. Like, when you think of the job of a professor, like, the public will think that they're teachers, right? But maybe undergrads would imagine them as researchers. But we know most tenured physics professors are not in the lab doing research. They're overseeing the research of like 10 different people. And yeah, they're giving feedback and giving ideas, but they're not actively doing the research. They are actively mentoring. And if you can't mentor students without sexually harassing them, you are bad at your job and you should be fired. It's baffling to me that people can still maintain that they're good researchers and they contributed anything to the field when they're actively taking away from it by ensuring that women leave because they keep harassing them. If you're a doctor and you can't see female patients without harassing them, you would get fired and you would lose your medical license. If you were an ice cream scooper and you can't serve female customers without sexually harassing them, you would get fired for being bad at your job. why is it suddenly like, but he's so good at his job, even though he can't mentor women or be around women or do anything that involves women without sexually harassing them? Like, he wasn't good at his job. He's not good at his job. And he didn't contribute anything to the field. He took away from the field by silencing the voices of all those women. So this is kind of the status quo right now. You can sexually harass and assault women up to a certain point, and then you'll be asked to resign. And there are a lot more like open secret guys that I didn't discuss that will probably have their big BuzzFeed expose in a couple years. That, again, they're just allowed to do this until some point where the school, or the people at the school, I should say, have decided enough is enough and like outrage, and then they resign with full benefits. But the way women handle this right now is with whisper networks. So if you're a woman and you're applying for a job, you might post on Twitter like, thinking of working at UCLA, smiley face, and then you just kind of await the DMs to see other women. Are they going to say that this is a bad idea? Are they going to name someone who they should watch out for? And it reminds me of something that happened to me when I was in graduate school. I started working with my advisor, who I finished my PhD with, and another professor approached me and they were like, oh, who did you decide to work with? And I told him, and he was like, oh, that's good. He'll be good for you. He's worked with women before. And at the time, I was like, that's a really weird thing for you to say to me. Like, women aren't different from men. Why would it matter if he had graduated a woman before? But like, I realized he was like, that's good. He'll be good for you. He is not going to sexually harass or assault you. Like, he was contributing to the Whisper Network. And now I realize that it's happening all the time. Like, you'll see postings like this, where it's like, hey, check in with the students before you take a job anywhere. And I gotta say, this is bad. This is not a fix to this problem, because not only does it make it harder for women to get a job, it's really limiting where they can take a job. Because like, oh, if you're an exoplanet person, I guess you can't go to Berkeley. You'll have to go somewhere else. And I also think it's bad because the women who are most vulnerable to sexual harassment and assault are undergrads. And undergrads are not, they don't have access to the Whisper Network because they don't know like females who are like higher up in the field. So right now it's primarily done on Twitter, but the kids aren't on Twitter. The kids are on TikTok. So whatever Whisper Network we have is not going to work for much longer, and like some astronomer is going to have to bite the bullet and like learn a TikTok dance and like point to random people they're not supposed to work with. And I don't think that's a good solution. I want to suggest an actual solution. And it seems so simple to me that I'm just shocked that we haven't done it yet. But like, let me remind you of our pie chart with our women and the sexually harassed women. And there's this teeny tiny fraction of men who are doing all this sexual harassing. So why not just kick them out? Is that crazy? Like, but let me talk about how we could do that. So first, I think we should have sexual harassment training and ethics statements that list what is included in sexual harassment that is attended by new employees, so new professors, new postdocs, and then also first-year graduate students. So everyone knows what is entailed in sexual harassment, everyone knows what behavior is appropriate and what is not, and we could invite the undergraduate researchers to go as well. We could also, as a department, tell the students how they will be supported in making Title IX complaints, and through our actions, actually support students when and if they have to do this. Right now, I've heard that like some departments will like give you a year of funding while you sort out finding a new advisor, and like great. But I also think if we could just ensure that the investigations happen in a timely manner and there's an actual resolution, that would be great. Next, do you know when you're filling out a letter of recommendation for a student and there's that dumb questionnaire that's like, Are they in the top 5% of your students, the top 1% of your students? I think it would be great if just below that, on every graduate student application, postdoc application, faculty job application, there was a question that was like, here's a link to our ethics statement that shows our sexual harassment guide. Has this student ever done anything that would go against this ethics statement? Because a trend I noticed is that these people often leave universities and they just go to a new university at a clean slate. And because letters of recommendation are so important in job applications, I have to assume that who's ever writing these letters is just completely ignoring this. So maybe instead we need to prompt them to discuss this with the hiring committee. Maybe someone will still get hired. Maybe you can be like, yes, there was a Title IX complaint 4 years ago. It was resolved. He's not done anything since then. And the hiring committee can decide what they want to do with that information. But I guess I would assume that people would write this in recommendation letters, but I just think we need to directly ask. 4, we should all, like at each university, sign this ethics complaint, and we should have detailed consequences that we actually pursue. So maybe a 3 strikes you're out situation, 3 well-documented, observed by multiple people, reported on, investigated on events, and then you're out. You grab a boob at a conference, you rub your dick on a girl at a telescope, and then you take a picture of a student sucking a lollipop in front of a class. Those are 3 things. Everyone saw them. You're done. You're out of astronomy. What does out of astronomy mean? You don't get to teach classes anymore. You don't have graduate students anymore. You don't get to go to conferences. You don't get to publish papers. And I think it would be great if when these people who have these documented, extreme, long listed sexual harassment allegations, I think it would be great if we stopped citing their papers. And I know what you're saying. I know the response to that might be negative. The way science works is someone does a thing, they write it up, and when you build on that, you need to cite that paper. But I have a workaround, especially for you exoplaneteers. I think summer of 2022, you get together, you have a big conference, and you dedicate it to just dissolving sexual harassment in your field. And the last week of this conference, you all work together, read every one of Marcy's papers, and write a really great, detailed review of his work. Just 70 pages of instrumentation, discoveries, analysis methods, results, all in one big document. And then in the acknowledgments, you can say this is dedicated to every woman who had to leave the field because, as a direct response to Marcy's behavior. And in all future papers, you can cite the review. And anyone who wants can go read the original papers, or they can read the lovely review that you all wrote and now gets to add to your H index or whatever. And I feel like people might think the no citing thing is extreme, but I want to talk about Feynman again. Feynman's reputation in the field of physics is such that he's seen as kind of a rock star, super cool scientist, even though when you read what he says about himself in his autobiographies about how he treated women and how he treated his female graduate students and what he thought of women who did physics, he says himself how disgusting he is, and he tells stories of his own sexual harassments and assault. And I don't think people understand the damage they do when they tell these stories about how cool Richard Feynman is, and then women go and read this information and they're like, do I belong in astronomy where this guy is seen as cool? A really great letter was written by a planetary scientist, actually. Hire her to replace Geoff Marcy, by the way. about the problem with Richard Feynman, and I want to read a quote from it. But we must consider Feynman in all his manifestations, a brilliant scientist, but also a narcissist whose sexist behavior did undeniable harm. And while his contributions to physics are immense, it is worth considering that science is not, nor has it ever been, a level playing field. It is unlikely that Feynman would have been able to make the scientific strides he did if he had been born 100 years earlier, when anti-Semitism would have barred him from elite academic spaces entirely. In the same vein, it is possible that someone else would have made Feynman's discoveries decades before him if the world were truly fair. Perhaps it would have even been a woman. I bet you Feynman Stans didn't think I was going to come for you. I was going to leave him in the Indiana Jones pot. No, absolutely not. So I want to end this section, and this might be the most controversial thing I'm going to say. I don't think it's good for the mental health of these men to keep receiving these mixed messages. Like, on the one hand, it's like, oh, you're retired. And then it's like, oh, but this group wants to write a paper with you. And so you're like, oh, I'm back. People like me again. And then that paper is published and there's huge backlash. And then you're like, oh, and then someone else asks you to write a paper and you're like, great, I'm back. Yay. And then you attend a Zoom colloquium and every woman in the audience is like, why is this guy here? This is terrible. And they go tweet about it later. Like, it's like if you're at a park and a parent is there with a kid and the kid is like, one more thing, I'm gonna do the slide. And then the parent's like, okay, but after that it's time to go. And then the kid does the swings and the parent's like, well, it's time to go. And the kid's like, one more thing. And he does the sandbox and he climbs the tower and he does the slide again. And then eventually the parent like has to go. So they grab the kid and the kid starts screaming and crying, one more thing, one more thing. And it's like, how did you expect that kid to know it was time to go when you kept letting him do one more thing? You weren't clear with the consequences. You weren't clear with the boundary setting. He has no idea it's time to go now because you kept letting him do one more thing. And I think very similarly, we let someone harass a bunch of women over 20 years and then suddenly there's consequences and then they're like, well, you can be an emeritus professor, and then suddenly there's consequences, and then suddenly you're on a nature paper, but then there's a huge backlash online. Like, it must be difficult. We're in the business of astronomy. Like, we're not a judge and jury. I don't expect these men to like not live their lives. Like, they should be able to go do a different career. They should never be in a mentoring position again, but like, go be a data scientist. I don't think they should leave their house and be ridiculed and have hot coffee thrown on them. They should be able to like get some therapy and leave a normal life. But we're not giving them that clear, like, you're out message. And I think it's going to do real harm to these men, and I don't think they should have to go through that. Does that make sense? I think that this kick them out plan is really easy and simple, and it almost seems so obvious. Like, oh, you have a problem with a small fraction of men harassing this huge fraction of women? Like, just get rid of those men. There are more women in the field, and they could be easily replaced by all those postdocs who want jobs. But I want to anticipate some criticism that this plan could receive. And if this was a seminar that I was giving to a real life audience, there would be time for that, where people would say things. And I think I can anticipate some of the major criticisms based on Twitter responses when people discuss this. So I have 4. Let's do it. The first is like, we're silencing men, cancel culture. And yes, that's the goal. I want to silence them. Like, that's the plan. They have silenced so many women over their careers. So many women have left the field directly because of their actions. Like, we don't know what those women would have accomplished. We don't know what their theses would have been. We don't know what good ideas they would have had. We don't know what kind of instrumentation or tools they would have developed. We will never know because their voices are gone. So they have silenced so many women, and that is the reason I want to silence them. I want to show other women that we care about what they have to say, we care about the science they are going to accomplish, and so they're out. Do I think this is canceling? Absolutely not. If you're bad at your job and you get fired, you're not canceled. You're fired. Like, they can go do whatever they want. The only thing I'm suggesting is that they're not invited to astronomy anymore. They ruined their reputation in this space. They can't be trusted here. They can't be trusted to be here without harassing and assaulting women, so they just don't get to come back. That's not canceled. That's just fired. Like, you're gone because you can't be trusted. Next, I'm scared to work with women now. What if they hit on me and it ruins my career? Well, I want to validate your fears that unwanted sexual harassment is a scary thing to have to deal with at work, and I don't think anyone should have to deal with that. And I'm always interested when men bring this up, like as a response to people talking about sexual harassment, because this literally happens all the time to women, and it almost seems like no one cares about it. There was a Twitter thread recently. I'm going to post some of the tweets, like pause and read them. But like, I saw a Reddit thread where a woman who was a professor was like, a male student found my address and after the semester was over, emailed me flowers and asked me on a date. She's like, how do I let him down gently? And it's like, call the police, because that's scary. And I want to tell my own story. I worked at a telescope as a graduate student. I did like the labs. So once or twice a week from like 9 to midnight, students would come in. I would put the telescope on an object. They would all look at it, and we would do 3 objects. They would go home and like do the homework related to it. One thing that's really cool to look at in an optical telescope is a binary star system, because oftentimes they're like different colors and they have different radii. And you can say, what would cause these stars who were born together from the same cloud, same distance from us, to look so different? And you can talk about stellar evolution and stuff. And when I'm talking about a binary star system, I always mention Star Wars, because like, you know, Luke's walking across the desert and like the 2 suns come out. That's what it's like to be in a binary star system. And this happened 3 times, but after I'm done looking at the objects, like most people would run out so they could go do their undergrad things. A few people would be fiddling with their backpacks, or someone would come ask me a question, and I would see a guy like shiftily looking around and waiting for everyone to leave. And when everyone left, he would come over and he would say, do you like Star Wars? And I would say, not really, more of a Trek fan. And then he would be like, what are you doing after? Do you want to like talk about Star Wars? We could like watch one of the movies. And I would be like, no, no thank you. Like, that would be weird. I'm your TA. And actually it would be sexual harassment because I have control over the grade, right? And they'd be like, okay, and they would leave. And like, they knew it was weird and inappropriate because they waited until we were alone to ask me. And after the second time that this happened, I was like, maybe this is a vibe that I'm putting out. So when I saw that student like shiftily looking around, I would walk over and be like, hey, do you have a science question? And they'd be like, no. And I'd be like, okay, I gotta wrap up, get out of here. And I would kind of like usher them out, you know? So now like they don't have the opportunity to ask me. But this is a thing that happens to women. Their students hit on them. Their students act inappropriately with them. And the departments, like, they don't really respond to this. But this is sexual harassment. So when you're worried that somehow a student could hit on you and then file a Title IX complaint, I want you not to worry about that, because the departments don't care. It happens all the time, and the departments don't care about it. But I think there's a linear relationship between students who are undergrads. They think it's okay to hit on their professors and their TAs. Between that and like your serial academic sexual harassers. Like, they see these men who are leaders in the field act that way. They read Richard Feynman's books about how he treats women, and they think that's what scientists do. And if we're not giving these men the consequences that they deserve for this long-term serial sexual harassment and assault, these men are going to be emboldened. They're going to think it's okay, and that's why they're doing it. I also think sexual harassment training would help to stop this. Maybe we could give undergrads consequences. Like, I don't think they should be kicked out of the field because they asked out their TA. Maybe they didn't realize how inappropriate that was, but like something needs to be done. Should they be forced to go to a harassment training? Yeah, but don't worry about a student making a false claim against you. Like, as long as you don't do anything, the department's not going to do anything about it, because it happens to women all the time. The next one that I see a lot is like, what if we go too far? What if a man accidentally gets accused and it ruins his career? And this one really bugs me, because you've heard of all the real victims that exist, these women whose careers were ruined, and you just immediately jump to some imaginary future where not only do we do something about sexual harassment, we're too stringent with it, and some imaginary future man's career got hurt. Like, that future doesn't exist. These women who actually had their careers harmed do exist, and you don't want to do anything about that because of this imaginary future. But I want to tell another story about an undergrad I know. So she told me this story in confidence. I'm going to change some of the details about the experiment and stuff so no one knows who she is, but I'm going to call her Kayla. She was an undergrad, and she got an appointment at the start of her junior year to work in a lab. So she and another undergrad who was a man were trained together on a piece of equipment over the summer, and then they were given like very similar but slightly different projects to work on, your standard undergrad situation. And she told me that she would go to the lab and he would like wait for her to show up, or he'd be like, "What time are you coming in tomorrow? Let's work together." And she started getting really uncomfortable. Like, he would ask her out and she would say, "No, thank you. I don't want to date anyone in my lab," or like, "I'm not dating anyone now." He would like buy her coffee and she'd be like, "Please stop buying me things. I don't want you to do this." One time he was like writing notes in his notebooks, and he was like, "Scientists have notes, they write in notebooks." And she was like, "I just keep mine on my computer." And he like bought her a notebook and then would like comment that she was never using the notebook even though she didn't want that. And eventually he just kept asking her out and she would say no, and he would like start getting like a little upset about it and be like, "When are you gonna say yes to me?" So she went to the PI, who was a man, and she was like, "The other student is asking me out. It's making me very uncomfortable. Like, it needs to stop. I don't know what can be done. I've told him how uncomfortable I am. I've told him a bunch of times. Like, it's been going on for 4 months. It needs to stop." So she doesn't know what happened. But, like, after that, the other student just wouldn't talk to her. He completely ignored her. So, like, she would come in. He would come in. He would say hi to everyone but her. If she, like, talked about something at a group meeting, he would be pretending not to listen and, like, scribbling on his paper. And, like, that's really unprofessional, but it was an improvement for her. So, like, months go by, and Kayla comes in on a Monday, and the postdoc in the lab, who's also a man, saw her and was like, "Oh, hey, it was your birthday. How did your birthday go?" And she told a story. She went on a date. The guy took her to a bar for the first time, and she was like, "He bought me a $17 cocktail. I've never had a cocktail. It was so fancy, and I was so excited. I think we're going to go out on Wednesday." And the undergrad was like, the male undergrad like heard this and was like seething, and he like slammed his hands on the table. He called her he said, "I would have bought you a $17 cocktail. What does he have that I don't have? Like, I'm so angry that you would do this here when everyone knew my intentions with you." And he like rushed towards the postdoc and Kayla, who's just standing there, and he like slammed his hands on the door. And then he turns around where her optical bench is and like fiddles with her. So like now her experiment's all misaligned. She's got to spend 3 weeks aligning all her optics equipment again. So the postdoc takes Kayla straight up to the PI's office, tells the story, which like good for male postdocs sticking up for women. And I want to ask you right now, what do you think happened? What did the PI do? What do you think he should have done? What would you do in this position? But I'll tell you, right? It's a video. So the PI is like, oh, well, I've never seen him behave like that. That seems really extreme. And the postdoc is like, that's what happened. It's unacceptable behavior. And Kayla is like, I feel uncomfortable, like something needs to happen. I will not be in the lab with him again. The PI just made a schedule, so they were never there on the same days. And Kayla was effectively punished. Like, she couldn't go to the lab whenever she wanted. She had to adhere to the schedule, and she wasn't going to go to group meetings anymore because the other students still went to group meetings. And they both got into grad school. And I'm sure the PI did not mention this story when he was writing the male undergrad student's rec letter, right? But maybe if he had been asked specifically on the application, like, has a student ever been a party to sexual harassment in a lab experience? Did they behave professionally in a lab? He would have been like, oh, that thing did happen, and he would write about it. And then that graduate program could decide, like, is this something we want to invite to our program? The number of things that can mess up your applications for graduate school, like, if you fall asleep the day you're supposed to register for classes and you can't sign up for any of those super cool physics electives that you wanted because they're full, and so you have to take, like, lower level classes that look bad on your transcript, like you were being lazy, like, that could make your graduate application look bad and you won't get in. Or if your dad died when you were taking E&M 2 and you got a C, like, well, you got a C, you're not cut out for graduate school. Or if you just happen to get B pluses, because B pluses are things you get because it's normal, now you don't get into grad school. I think we could add to the list, like, harassed a woman over a year and then physically rushed her and then messed with her experiment. That is a thing that graduate school should know about that may not get you into graduate school. That may be the thing that's like, oh, we don't want this in our program. And I think that's fine. I don't think that's an innocent mistake. Like, he was given options to stop. That's not an innocent mistake. That's a big mistake. That's like a big character flaw, and that should go in the grad application. I also want to finish the story from before. I said that the telescope thing happened 3 times, and then I told about how the second time I changed my behavior. So the third time this happened, I had ushered the student out, so he was not in the building. So I ushered him out, everyone leaves, it's a normal evening. I do the telescope things, I close the dome, I home the telescope, I turn off the computer, I'm like grabbing the sign-in sheets, cleaning all the things. And I go to leave the building, and the telescope's on top of a parking garage. I turn around, I've locked the door behind me, and the guy peeks out. He's like, hey. And I was like, because, like, now it's later. And now I'm definitely alone. Like, everyone has gone home. It's like 1 a.m. And he's like, hey, what are you doing after? Do you want to, like, chat? And I was like, no. If you have a question, you can email me. I'm going to go home now. And I start, like, booking it to the stairs because it's on the 4th floor. And the guy just walks with me, and I'm, like, bounding down the stairs, and he's talking about something. I have no idea because I was terrified. And I get to the bottom, and I'm like, my office is in the ChemPhys building. It's across the street. Or I have, like, a 5-minute walk home. I don't want this guy to know where I live. And he's like, well, where are you going? I'll walk with you. And I was like, I'm going home alone. I do not want you to walk with me. And he's like, oh, it's fine. No worries. I can walk with you. And I was like, no, I do not want that. Please leave me alone. And so I decided I'm going to go to my office. So I walk across the street to the building, and he's walking with me. I scan my little key card. The door opens, and he grabs it to, like, hold it open for me. And so I go in the building, and I just turn around, and I pull the door shut behind me because I assume he doesn't have a card and he can't get in. And so now I'm in the locked building. I just go up to my office. I called my partner, crying, told him what happened, and then I left through a different exit, and I walked home. Nothing else happened. And I think if we plotted that on our little diagram, it's like he waited, and that's creepy, but he was just talking to you, and he's your student. Maybe he had a question. And then it's like, I told him to leave me alone. I told him no, but he's just walking with me. Like, it's fine. And then he held the door open for me, and that's nice. And so I don't even think I told, like, the telescope director or anyone about this, because it's like, nothing happened, right? Like, I pulled the door shut and he looked at me like I was the rude, crazy person. And I feel like if I were to tell someone this and how terrified I was, they would be like, but nothing happened. Like, it was just a student. Like, why are you being so weird about this? But the fact is that that story has happened at the ChemPhys building at UK before. In 1985, a woman was working in a chemistry lab late at night. She leaves to get a burger, and I'm recounting the one news article I found about this, and then professors who told me about this story who were there in 1985. But she leaves to get a burger or a coffee. She gets the thing, and there's a man at the restaurant who's like, oh, do you work in the chemistry building? And she's like, yeah. And they like walk back together, and she puts her key in the door, and he doesn't have a key. He doesn't work there. So she's like, I'm going to go to work now. And so she goes in, and he like sticks his foot in the door. He waits a minute. He follows her in. He waits outside her lab, and when she leaves to go to the bathroom at like 1 a.m., he follows her into the bathroom and he rapes her and strangles her. And she's dead now. And again, if you plot this story, it's functionally identical to mine until you get to this inflection point. Like, did he get in the door or did he not get in the door? And so you might look at my story and say, well, that wasn't that bad. It was just a weird guy. He didn't understand social cues. But when you compare it to her story, it's identical. And this is the fear that women live with every day. I don't think it would be a bad thing if we mentioned the sexual harassment committed by undergrads in our recommendation letters. I don't think it would be a bad thing to have ethics commitments on graduate school applications. I am not worried about kicking that type of person out of the field. I'm more worried about the women in the field. And like I said, there's a line between undergrads who think it's okay to harass their TAs and these men, these leaders in the field who just serially sexually assault and harass undergrads. And I don't think it's hyperbolic to suggest that one day we're going to have a story like this in astronomy and someone is going to get hurt. Because right now we're doing nothing. And so the idea that you are more worried about this future hypothetical man who might have like a career offset because he wanted to be a physicist and then he just kept harassing his colleagues. Like, I'm not worried about that man. I'm right here, right now, in the world we live in where women are harassed and assaulted, and I'm worried about those women. So that one about worrying about future hypothetical mistakes men might make really bothers me. Like, it bothers me that you would jump to worrying about future men rather than the actual women that exist right now. But the next criticism I'm going to anticipate is completely baffling to me. And that is when people say, shouldn't we forgive? Are we going too far? Should we give them another chance? And it's bonkers. Like, Geoff Marcy had a yearly meeting with the Title IX office where they were like, you gotta stop it, bud. You gotta stop. Something serious might happen if you don't stop. Like, how many chances do you want to give him? Like, more than 20 years worth? Like, what's the number of chances that's good for you? And if we look at how many amazing postdocs leave the field every year because they can't find a faculty job, like, why do we suddenly care about retention in this single instance? Like, no one cares that more women leave the field than men. No one cares that postdocs, amazing postdocs with funding and papers and research programs, can't get a faculty job, or they don't want to move, so they just go get a data science job and make 3 times as much money as we make. No one cares that there are women who want to have children, and so they have to leave the field. There are women who are caretakers to their elderly relatives, so they can't leave, like, the tri-state area. There are tons of reasons that people are kicked out of the field every single year. Why do we suddenly care that we're kicking this person out of the field? This person deserves to get kicked out of the field. We could retain one of these other lovely people. Last year, I had the privilege of hosting the Gila Astrophysics seminar, and I was just getting so many, like, amazing postdocs to come give talks. Like, these postdocs have so many papers. They have research programs. They're ready for faculty jobs. Like, a third of them were in exoplanets. People are super into exoplanets right now. If you need someone who can do whatever Geoff Marcy was going to do on your paper, if you need someone to be on your faculty to replace Geoff Marcy, like, send me an email and I will send you a list of amazing postdocs who are ready for that opportunity. And I'm not joking. Send me an email and I will send you a recommendation for who you should hire. Like, the idea that we suddenly care that the field is going to shrink a little bit because we kicked out the serial academic sexual harasser is baffling. Like, tell me why you want them here. Tell me what they've added, because they've added nothing. They were bad at their jobs. They forced women to leave. They have a negative addition to the field. They've silenced so many future researchers. Like, they've contributed nothing. Like, why would we want them? So, let's say this plan of kicking them out actually works. Like, it's a thing we all decided to do. I know that's not going to happen, but let's say we did. We throw these men in the trash. Like, they go on to live their lives. They become billionaires with their data science companies, and they write their New York Times bestsellers on climate change. Like, what does justice actually look like? When people talk about this, they spend so much time focusing on the feelings and the egos of these men who are perpetrating these crimes against women. And not enough time is spent talking about the women, because I feel like we have to spend so much time, like, not only convincing people that this is a problem, but convincing them that it happens, convincing them there should be consequences, that, like, the women who are victims just get tossed aside. But I want to take this moment to say that there is no justice for them. There's no way we could even think of what justice would look like. The way our field works is that you have to be continually exceptional. You have to be the best of your year every single year. So if your career is slightly derailed because you're spending a lot of time in the Title IX office, you might not get a postdoc that year. And if you don't get a postdoc that year, you're definitely not going to get a postdoc the next year. Or maybe you spend 4 years working with this harasser and you just can't take it anymore. So you file a Title IX complaint and your committee's like, oh, we'll fund you for a year. You can find a new advisor. Like, are you supposed to start a new project? Are you supposed to start at year 0 of your PhD? Because then you're going to apply for jobs. They're going to be like, why did it take you 9 years to get a PhD? Like, there's no recovery from this. Like, I know that some of the women were able to move on and have successful careers, and I think that's great. But the majority of women they're just forced to leave. And 10 years later, when their harasser finally gets asked to retire with full benefits, they don't just get to jump back on the wagon and get in the field again. Like, they're gone forever. The only thing we can do is ensure that this doesn't happen again. The only thing we can do is kick these men out and make sure everyone in the field knows how unacceptable this behavior is, so there are no more victims. In my opinion, that's the only justice. And my big plan of kick them out is, it's like not gonna happen, right? Like, the way we've seen people behave, like, people want to work with serial sexual harassers. There's nothing we can do about that. But I think as individuals, we have much more power than we think. As an early career researcher, you can decline to be on papers with these people. You can decline to join the group of someone who works with these people. Like, if you're at a conference and one of these open secret sexual harassers is there, ask for your money back and leave. And publicly talk about how this is the reason you left. Like, if you're sent a paper to review and it has a serial sexual harasser in the author list, refuse to review it because of ethics reasons. If you're an editor and you get one of these papers, just reject it. Like, surely you have a scientific ethics statement. Refuse to publish these papers. Like, all of these things will eventually add up to people finding it not worth it to work with these people anymore. And I think that is an actual realizable thing we can do. But when we talk about justice, there is no justice. Even if the work of these men looks so amazing and so prolific, and they look like geniuses that deserve the Nobel Prize, like, what they have taken from our field, what they have taken from the collective knowledge is not knowable, it's not countable. The women they have silenced might have been better than them. They might have had better techniques. They might have done everything, but we'll never know. And the number of women that have been kicked out of the field because they've been sexually harassed or assaulted is so large that I have to assume that one of them would have been a genius superstar rock star scientist, and we'll never know. And there's no justice. There's no fixing that. Hi, I'm editing again. No one's gonna watch an hour and 45 minutes. This is impossibly long. It is almost over because I'm gonna cut a 40-minute clumsy, terrible discussion on intersectionality, because all I talked about was sexual harassment, and I didn't mention any of the other issues in astronomy that intersect with this. Like, in the real world, outside academia, women of color are much more likely to be sexually assaulted and harassed than white women. And queer women are much more likely to be sexually assaulted and harassed than straight women. And trans women are much more likely to be sexually assaulted and harassed than cis women. And when we look at the demographics of astronomy, and we're like, where are the women of color? Where are the trans women? Where are the queer women? This has got to contribute to that. Like, the lack of people here. Like, the demographics of physics don't match the demographics of the world, and that's a problem. And I think this issue of allowing sexual harassers and abusers to just live in the field like it's fine is a contributor to that problem, because how can we ask these women to stay when they are going to be mistreated? I think it deserves longer than the crappy 40 minutes of me discussing it. It deserves to be its own topic on its own video, but I just want you to think about that for just a second right now, because all these issues intersect. I'm gonna end now. I mentioned up top that this is just for me. Like, I just want to say these things, and maybe they'll leave my brain every time this happens. I can just retweet it, and I won't have to think about it. I don't have hope that people will suddenly start caring about the experiences of women. I don't have hope that people will suddenly start caring that men have been sexually assaulting and harassing women for a couple of decades, and people still work with them like it's fine. Like, this obviously isn't as simple for everyone else in the field. Other people have different priorities and want to continue working with these people. So I don't think it'll get fixed. I just hope I don't have to think about it ever again. But since it's not going to get fixed immediately, I do have two small requests. The first is that collectively as a group, we just stop pretending that we don't understand the leaky pipeline. I made a joke earlier, like, it was like, oh, it's a big mystery, like, women leave, that's weird. And if I have to read another article that's like, maybe women don't like physics, maybe it's too hard, maybe the textbook should be pink, maybe she's too attractive to be taken seriously. Like, we know why there's a leaky pipeline. It's because of sexual harassment and assault. Sure, like, there are systemic issues, like women are often caregivers, they want to have children, like, there are some things that might contribute, but as long as this situation is persisting, we don't have a question why there's a leaky pipeline. Women leave because they are sexually harassed and assaulted with no consequence. They are seen as exposable to support the egos of these men who are just allowed to do it and are supported by people in the field who continue to work with them. That's why there's a leaky pipeline. My second request is for the people who work with these men, including the people, like the open secret guys who haven't been exposed by BuzzFeed yet. Like, if you're gonna work with these men, I think you owe it to your students, you owe it to the postdocs that are gonna join your lab to warn them before they join your lab for two reasons. The first is if they're a woman, they're obviously at risk of being sexually harassed or assaulted, and you don't want to be like feeding them to these men. But secondly, I think you should warn them because it might have negative effects on their career in the future. Maybe in 10 or 15 years people will look differently on this, and they might be cautious about working with someone who in the past has been totally fine with working with an out and proud serial academic sexual harasser. Maybe that will affect how their papers are cited. Maybe that will affect who hires them for jobs, because if you have 3 identical fantastic candidates and one of them just happens to keep working with a serial academic sexual harasser, that's like a mark against them, right? They don't want to bring that into their university. They don't want to tell the women in their department that that's okay, so they're going to hire these 2 guys. And I've already seen a victim of this. The lead author on one of these papers that Marcy put out this summer was a graduate student. And he posted like your standard like paper day, so excited on Twitter. And he got so much hate of just like, how could you work with this man? Like, what are you doing? What are you saying to the women of the field? Like, how dare you do this? And I'm convinced he had no idea. He wrote like an apology on Twitter that was like, I believe women, I support women, I never would have done this if I had known. I will never work with him again, and I'm ashamed that he's on this paper, and I'm so sorry. And I feel so bad for him because his advisor threw him under the bus and didn't tell him in advance that this is going to receive backlash every single time you publish a paper. Every single time you do this, you are going to get backlash. And you shouldn't do that to a student. You're supposed to support your students. You need to warn them that's going to happen. The last thing to say. When people talk about the lack of women in astronomy, they talk about 2 things, like retention, which is a leaky pipeline. We know why there's a leaky pipeline. And then they talk about recruiting women. And I've always thought that that was weird. Because I do a lot of outreach. I do a lot of outreach with kids, and kids love astronomy. Girls love astronomy, boys love astronomy. Every time you do an event, there's going to be a little girl there with her little NASA shirt. She's going to have a little book of facts memorized, and she's going to be like, according to my calculations, we should be able to see Mars tonight. And I'll be like, yeah, and I'll pull up the telescope, you know? Like, girls want to do science. Space is cool. Girls love science. Like, why are we even worried about recruiting women? Like, it doesn't make sense. Like, people love science. And now I just think, like, can we recruit women? Like, morally, is that something I want to do? Like, look at these little girls. I feel like we should warn them what's going to happen. Like, we need to look at these little girls and say, 75% of you are going to be sexually harassed or assaulted. Like, you're going to go to your first conference, you're going to be so excited to present your poster, but the most famous man there is allowed to grab your and no one's going to do anything about it, and you're never going to do science again. You're going to get into your dream school at Caltech, and your professor is going to fall in love with you, and when you turn him down, he's going to write you really bad rec letters every time you apply to a postdoc, and you just won't get one. And you're going to have to spend the rest of your life reading articles about how women don't like space. Like, look at this little girl.
3, 2, 1, blast off! Go space, go space, go, go, go space.
Who's going to tell her? I have a couple more years as a postdoc, and I'm excited to keep doing astronomy research. But I just don't think a public discussion of this topic is going to help my tenure track applications too much. Like, so many people in the field are just willing to ignore this or willing to work with people who do it like it's fine, and that can't be good for me when applying for jobs. But maybe I don't want to work in a field that's gonna punish me for saying sexual harassment is bad, actually. But I do need to make money. So like and subscribe. Join my Patreon. Watch my next video. A physicist lists the top 10 greatest sci-fi novels of all time. Number 1 will surprise you. It's Lord